Good. All right, well, welcome everybody. My name is Steve Eccles. I'm the CEO and Dean of Northeastern University in Vancouver. I'm really pleased to be here on campus with our wonderful students. I hope you're all doing well, and I know how hard you're working, and welcome to the event. I want to begin by first of all acknowledging that the land on which we're gathered is the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and that includes the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. But we're absolutely delighted to welcome such a brilliant panel today. I know we're going to have an entertaining session, and it's going to be far more entertaining if I quickly get out of the way and pass over to the fabulous Dr. Yvonne Cody. Yvonne.
Thank you, Steve. And yeah, I'm so excited to be here. So grateful to our panel. Really grateful to the support that Northeastern in Vancouver has given us here. We get to be with people in 3 dimensions live. Also over at the University of Victoria, we've got a lot of representation on the line. The Digital Supercluster also announced our event, so I was really excited to see that we might have participation and certainly have had support there. Have to give a big shout out to Olivia Norton, who really did design this event. So if Olivia, I know you're out there, we're going to get you connected for the next event. And of course, our panelists. So we're here to talk about the 21st century rewrite. And I'm Yvonne Cody, and I'm a professor of computer science at the University of Victoria and a visiting professor here at Northeastern University. And I don't often get to give that as an assignment for students. You know, hey, everybody, next week, could you turn in your 21st century rewrite, please? But today, I think we're going to really get it started. But this is a start of a conversation. We'll have to do multiple sessions for people that are interested. We will keep you posted. Our panelists are going to kick things off by, first of all, challenging the metrics that we use for the economy. And that's going to be Mark Podlasly, an advisor to the BC Assembly of First Nations. And once he's shaken our ideas of metrics, James Raymond is going to step in, a senior manager of research at the Vancouver Economic Commission. And James is going to help us think about what it would look like to change metrics for a city like Vancouver or a region like Cascadia. But no, it doesn't stop there, because Josha MacNab, who is the Director for National Policy and Strategy at the Pembina Institute, is going to give us a nationwide perspective on what it could look like if we're changing our metrics. And we're not stopping there either, because Will Parkinson, who's a technical product manager at a company called Earth Daily Analytics, is going to put it on a planetary scale. What are the new tools that we need to measure, and how does that feed back into new metrics that we might have? So without further ado, I'd love to turn it over to Mark. Thanks.
Well, thank you. And I'm glad some of you are in person. Enjoy it. One day we'll all get to meet. So my name is Mark Podlasly. My ancestral name is Tasha. I'm a member of the Untitled First Nation, which is Interior Salish. Right now you're in Coast Salish territory. We're next door. And we're about 6,000 people in the First Nation that stretches basically from Merritt, sort of south of Kamloops, down into the United States, over to the Lower Mainland, and back up to Lytton. And I'm here today as an advisor to the BC Assembly of First Nations. And your homework, which I've been told you're going to be getting, is this paper, which was a paper that was published by the BC Assembly of First Nations. And it was a question about, the question that came to the Assembly was thinking, well, what happens post-pandemic? What does a rebuild look like in our society? And from a First Nations perspective, there's not a lot of interest in rebuilding exactly what we had before the pandemic. If you look at how the provincial economy is calculated in this province, the economy is about $306 billion per year. That was the latest number that came out. And of that, that works out to about $60,000 per person, per capita in the entire economy. And the question came from the leadership of the Assembly of First Nations is how much of that is attributable to the First Nations of this province? If you know BC's history, most of the province is unceded territory. And the wealth of this province in terms of oil, gas, timber, fisheries, energy production, all comes from that land base. So if you look at to see how much of that income, $60,000 per year, 306 billion a year comes from First Nations? The answer is exactly zero. If anything, we as Indigenous people are a net drain on the economy as it's measured right now, because we do not produce what is measured by this economy. This economy is measured by something called GDP, and it is the indicator that the province uses to determine the economic output of the province. And Canada uses it, and most nations around the world do. I do have some slides I could show you, although I'm a bit concerned of the technical backflips I need to do to make that work. Yeah, there you go. I have to turn them off, and I'm going to come up. Okay.
Perfect, Mark. Thank you.
It's this one, right? Nope, that's me. It's this one. This is the challenge with all these different...
I know, and this is a really different one.
Yeah, okay, here we go. Here it is. Let's see if it works. No, it's not going to work. We will fly without them. Don't you love this? It's like watching your mom trying to figure out how she gets on. Yeah, forget it. We're going to go without. Okay.
Okay.
That's fine. So the economy itself, the question is, how much do the First Nations contribute to this provincial economy? None. We're a net drain on the economy based on GDP. GDP is a formula that was put together to measure the national income. It first came out, Simon Kuznets, and if you've done your reading on the Doughnut economics, you'll see that also features prominently in her work. He came up with this thing called gross national product, which was a way to indicate to the government, which didn't have anything at that time, what the income was, the national income of the entire nation, which was needed in the Great Depression. That formula then in 1944 became adopted worldwide through Bretton Woods, coming up to the end of World War II, and then eventually was adopted by the entire planet. The problem is it only measures basically production. GNP became GDP, and it measures gross domestic product. The problem is how it's calculated is only at the time things that you could drop on your foot. It's stuff. It's been adapted here and there over time, but it excludes all the things that Indigenous people value, especially here in Coast Salish territory and in the territories of British Columbia. Things like regenerative forests, fisheries, land that supports a community through cultural activities. It does not calculate things like volunteer work by people in cultural or familial support. What's interesting about the pandemic when this hit is that our GDP as a province fell off a cliff because all of a sudden the production of things was stopped or at least severely hampered when GDP was impacted by the shutdowns and COVID. But what are the things that people really value through this period? Social connections to family and friends, the ability to go into forests and have space, socially distanced space to regenerate, to de-stress. The concept of what is important to us as a nation and as a province are all of a sudden directly in line with what Indigenous people in this province have found of value. So the question is, when we start to rebuild going forward, what are the values that we need to take forward as a society that actually calculate what our wealth is? Is our wealth just the $60,000 per year production of stuff, or is it something else? Is it something else that gives us a meaning to our lives, safety and everything from food security to societal connections? What is it? I presume you've done the readings, is that in the Doughnut economics author, she's talking very much about that. It's a regenerative economy that does not exceed the ability of its people to be happy through just stuff. She has a very interesting diagram about talking about the limits of a closed system economy, but we can only go as far as our environment will allow us. But from an Indigenous perspective, these values are already built in. In the report, when you get to it, you'll see what we did was that we asked that question, and we came to that answer that we actually didn't calculate into anything in the economy. We asked, what could be different? What would an economy look like with Indigenous values incorporated into the planning of what makes wealthy people? And we looked worldwide to see if anyone else is doing this, and we found several examples. The first one, back in 1972, was Nepal in something called the Gross National Happiness Index. It sounds very hippie-ish, doesn't it? It's gross, what makes happiness? But if you look through the economy, the planning of how they came to put that together, it calculates things in like your place in culture, your connections to people, your cultural values, What does it mean to be Bhutanese? That eventually got picked up by the United Nations and then got turned into a world index as well on what is not just happiness, but sort of prosperity and development. It's got picked up by other nations and now is being used by nations around the world in some form to try and make a better calculation of what makes wealth. What is wealth? So the one thing that we did drill into and we were looking for were indigenous examples of where values that are indigenous are incorporated into a larger society. And we found the best example in New Zealand. New Zealand has recently come out with something called the wellness budget, where they're actually trying to focus in how they make planning decisions for their people. And they've decided to go they didn't scrap GDP, but they're trying to go beyond it to a multi-generational planning for decisions. And that means health. That means the environment. And so if you take a look at the report, you'll see it, and you can go online. If you Google New Zealand and the wellness budget, you'll find the Prime Minister talking brilliantly about it, in the sense that no decisions can be made for spending unless the minister can show that there's multi-generational benefits to improve the conditions of New Zealanders and of New Zealand as a land. They have a specific focus ensuring that indigenous people through the Maori are included in that process. And they're very focused on ensuring that those sorts of values translate not just to Maori and not just to non-Indigenous, but everybody. They are now the leading example of what can be done. And that's something that we're going to start focusing on at the Assembly of First Nations in the next version of this report. And we've already been in touch with the Maori to see how they've made that happen, to see, okay, what are the things that we want to build into our wealth definition going forward? This will be done in concert with the BC government, who is also on board because they've been asking the same questions. So it will be a fascinating exercise to take these examples and see how would they apply to the economic planning of this province. One last thing, and I'm going to turn it over, is that there is something called the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And if you Google that, you'll find that countries around the world are doing exactly this. Countries like Iceland, Scotland, Finland, countries around the world are starting to ask these questions. Is the production of stuff enough? Is it good for us? And the question most of them come to the conclusion is no, but they are plotting where they're going to go next. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Mark. And I'm sorry about the technical gymnastics that we have to do here, but that was fantastic. Thank you. Okay, I think we've got the stage set. I know that everyone's got their homework ready. My homework too is to make sure that we can tie all these things together. We're going to turn it over to James from the Vancouver Economic Commission. And I think, James, for you to be able to share your slides, I think everyone on the stage has to turn their cameras off.
Like Will did last time.
Perfect.
Just can everyone see
Yes.
the slide there? Fantastic, excellent. It's really tough to follow Mark. I could listen to Mark speak all day. I will absolutely try my best though. So yeah, thank you so much for the invite, Yvonne. It's actually a pleasure to be here today, and it's always a pleasure to speak with the next generation. So I'm James Raymond, the Senior Manager of Research at Vancouver Economic Commission. And today I just want to tell you a bit about the challenge of using GDP in the context of cities and share some other economic frameworks that have been developed to try and better measure prosperity and well-being. So just a quick bit about ourselves. Our purpose is to support the building of a prosperous, inclusive, low carbon and resilient economy for all in Vancouver. And we do this by utilising 4 key principles. So we have a local focus. We prioritise climate action in all of our work. We work to deliver meaningful economic reconciliation, and we try our best to ensure prosperity shared by all and not just the lucky few. So on to GDP, the topic of today. Well, you know, as measured by GDP, Vancouver was actually the fastest growing economy in Canada over the last decade. We used to average about 3% growth. So we always used to be sort of in the middle of the pack of the largest Canadian cities on this sort of ranking. But when the oil price dropped, Calgary and other cities, their GDP rate dropped dramatically. And Vancouver has a very diverse economy, and it was well set up to benefit also from the tech boom that we've seen in the last decade. So we took the lead in this race that most politicians seem to care so much about. Obviously, it suffered a dip in 2020 with COVID, but was forecast to come roaring back. But as you've just heard from Mark, there are a huge number of challenges with using GDP as the be-all and end-all economic indicator. So I'll add another challenge to what Mark said. GDP growth is increasingly going towards the rich. So here's a photo of Occupy. I think it's really interesting to note that this movement started in Vancouver. So this was a campaign from Adbusters magazine, which is in Vancouver, and it became a global movement to tackle equality, which, and let's be honest, has got even worse since Occupy first came about. So it's important to point out that GDP didn't used to be so bad and misleading. After World War II, GDP growth did actually align with a rise in living standards in the West. But this actually coincided with a rise globally, or at least in the West, or in inequality. So the 1970s were actually our most equal decade. And then we had Reagan and Thatcher and neoliberal policies coming in, such as deregulating markets, that really affected that. And we started going back the other way. But even if we were a completely equal society, GDP would not be the perfect metric. I particularly love this economist, Jason Hickel. He really nails it, I think, with these two tweets. So it's astonishing when you think about it that the dominant belief in economics hold that no matter how rich a country is, their GDP should keep rising year after year with no identifiable endpoint, irrespective of the ecological cost. It's the definition of absurdity. And then the second one is, to get a sense for how unhinged our economy is from the real world, consider the fact that pollinators, earthworms, rainforest, clean air, parenting, friendship, sleep, and solidarity considered to be literally valueless according to our dominant metric of economic success. So furthermore, on a city level, there are some other challenges with using GDP. So the first being that it's not even actually available accurately at a city or metro level. So there are estimates, and that's the ones I just shared earlier, but they're based on job numbers, and they're not even accurate because we don't, for example, know what are the imports and exports to cities. Secondly, GDP is really bad at measuring services. So cities increasingly now sell services, not goods. And so if you think about a company like Twitter, it basically has zero GDP value. It's just a service. And GDP really struggles to measure things like that. The third is that, we're very unequal, and there's evidence that the faster GDP grows, the more unequal your city becomes. So not only is chasing GDP misleading, it's potentially very dangerous. And also, the fourth thing would be, despite everything you've heard already so far, there's still pressure, formal, informal pressure for me and cities to report it. So people, politicians, investors, the media, everyone expects to see that on our website, on our Twitter. People want to see it. There's a whole system set up around GDP. There's so many other measures that connect to it, like debt to GDP ratio, or the percentage of GDP spend on R&D or healthcare or education. It's completely embedded in our Western society. But if you're still not convinced, and Mark's mentioned it already, I urge you to pick up this book. I don't have enough time today to really dive into it too much, but in it, what I particularly like is that Kate attacks the predominant way that economics is taught still this day throughout the world. So, for example, she secretly sits in on an Oxford University economics class, and she's kind of shocked at how they're still teaching the same old kind of economics twaddle. It's really helped me understand why I found it so challenging to study economics when I was at university, when I just disagreed with so much of it. But in this book, Kate proposes a different, and I would argue, a much smarter economic framework. And it's one that, as Mark said, enables us to thrive, but crucially within planetary boundaries. And if that model looks a bit too esoteric and theoretical and academic, well, I urge you to think again, because Amsterdam are already working on it. And I know this is really small, but just the 4 questions they've asked and have worked through collectively as a community. What would it mean for the people of Amsterdam to thrive? What would it mean for Amsterdam to thrive within its natural habitat? What would it mean for Amsterdam to respect the well-being of people worldwide? And what would it mean for Amsterdam to respect the health of the whole planet? And they've really got into the details. So you can look at that. It's online. But it's not just Amsterdam. Vancouver's looking at this. Toronto, Barcelona, Sydney, Portland, many cities around the world now. and crucially, C40, which is an organization of the world's leading cities tackling climate change, are really pushing this idea forward, and they are working with Kate Raworth. And C40 is really powerful because it now represents a quarter of the world's population. And I think it's particularly important because I think cities are going to lead the change on tackling all of society's issues, from climate change to racism to inequality to economic reconciliation. They're the first line, the most responsive level of government, and they can do things a lot faster than most countries, perhaps with the exception of New Zealand and Iceland. But even closer to home, we were delighted to see this news from just a few months ago. So it shows this concept is not just something for big cities, but for communities of all sizes, like Nanaimo. And you've heard from Mark, the BC Assembly First Nations is working on a much smarter framework for true prosperity and well-being. And I was so excited to see that paper. I urge you all to read it. And I've begged Mark for us to be involved in any way possible because I'm such a big fan of it. So looking forward to seeing that as it develops. But, you know, and this is all in Mark's report. Just to give you a quick snapshot on some of the other frameworks that are out there. There have been so many attempts over the years. You heard about Bhutan's, the EU, France, UK, many countries tackled it. There's some economic organizations that have looked at it as well. So this is the OECD's Better Life Index, and that came out in 2011 and has been updated every year. And you can see Canada's ranking there. There's one called the Legate and Prosperity Index. And this has been going for over a decade. And again, every country is ranked on a number of criteria, from safety and security to personal freedom to health and education and natural environment. And even the World Economic Forum know the game is up for GDP and it's time to move beyond it. And I really want to highlight this term beyond GDP because it's the one that I use to describe what we're talking about today. And it says, okay, look, GDP has some value. Let's not throw it out completely. It has some merit, but we just need to move way beyond it. And I particularly like this one because it's really quite simple. It has 12 metrics that roll up into one, and it covers inclusion. Mark talked about intergenerational equity, sustainability. So it's pretty good. But, you know, even then, there's challenges with this. So, you know, is measuring the carbon intensity of GDP, it's in this bottom corner here, is that really enough to measure climate change? I would suggest it isn't. And also, I could even pick apart measuring inequality by something like the Gini, income Gini index, because, you know, increasingly rich people don't file their tax incomes. They are parking their money overseas where it's untraceable. So even this stat, there's a problem with it. So, you know, nothing really is perfect, and we really need to think about what are the right metrics. So I'll end up on this, really, this question back to you, anyone listening today. You know, we've got to start somewhere, and Mark has shown us one way forward, and I think it's one we really all should get behind in BC. But just to say that no data is perfect, although anything we can do to get us to move beyond GDP is going to be a much better, smarter step forward. So a question for you to think about is, you know, how should we measure prosperity and well-being in BC and Cascadia? We've got huge opportunity. There's a lot of movement behind this now. But what would be the key indicators, the most important indicators for you? So that's pretty much it. Just want to flag, if you're interested in anything of what I've said, I urge you to sign up for our economic newsletter, which is called The Lens. So thank you very much. And I am going to try and come out of this. How's that? Can you see me? Great. Back to you.
Fantastic, James. Oh, that's great. Okay. We've got the scene set. we've established alternative metrics potentially. We've talked about how a city can be quite agile, and this is the way forward potentially, especially with where James is at with the Vancouver Economic Commission. All sorts of opportunities here. Let's turn it over to Josha MacNab. Again, Josha is the Director for National Policy and Strategy at the Pembina Institute. So let's get a nationwide perspective. Thank you, Josha.
Thanks so much. So I'll just caveat this by saying that when Dr. Cody first approached me and started talking about donuts, I really had no idea what she was talking about. So I'm so grateful to the first two speakers. I've just learned so much about GDP. That's fantastic. And I'm going to talk about another three-letter acronym, which is GHGs, and talk about how all of this relates together. I am also going to try and do the magic gymnastics of sharing my screen here. So let's see if this works.
Yes.
Yes. All right.
I'm intimidated by the technical prowess of my co-presenters here.
It's not fair, Mark. You,
No,
you
exactly.
went first.
If a presentation happened and where there are no slides, did the presentation happen?
Right. Okay, so I'm gonna sort of put all of this in a sort of different context, come at this from a different point of view, which is focused on climate change, which is focused on GHG emissions, and focused on our national commitment to get to net zero by 2050, and unpack a little bit of what that means. I realize I am not in presenter mode, but I'm just gonna leave it alone because I think that might just make everything go crazy. So as long as I can advance my slides here, we should be fine. There we go. Okay. So yes, I'm the National Policy Director for the Pembina Institute. For those of you who are not familiar about us, we are a national clean energy think tank, and we advocate for strong and effective policies for Canada's clean energy transition. Happy to talk more about that later if anyone is interested. So, of course, all of this conversation is happening in the context of the fact that we know that we need to maintain our global warming to lower than 1.5 degrees Celsius. I'm not going to go through the sort of kinds of impacts that are likely to occur after we surpass 1.5 degrees. Happy to talk about that. But the main point that I want to get across is that we are not on track. We are very far from being on track to keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees. And I want to talk today specifically about Canada and where Canada is at on this trajectory. So if you see this chart here, I'm not sure how large that is for everybody, but what you really need to know is the little orange dot down in the bottom corner at 2050 is net zero. And the other orange dot up there is the 2020 target. And the one in the middle is the 2030 target. And you can see that various projections are showing that even our most ambitious projections at this point, which would require a fairly significant change in course from where we are, show us as being far away from where we need to be in terms of bending that curve down towards net zero. So that's just from an emissions point of view. And there's been a lot of talk about net zero, and I want to spend a little bit of time unpacking what that means. So this is a more simplified version of that slide I just showed you, which essentially just assumes basically a straight line between where we are and the 2050 target. So that's essentially what we need to do to flatten Canada's climate curve and get from where we are today to where we are in 2050. But the challenge with net zero and the challenge with this framework that we've created around understanding our emissions trajectory and our target of net zero is that net zero and 1.5 degrees are not synonymous. We can quite easily achieve net zero by 2050 and massively overshoot 1.5 degrees. And I'll just show you this next slide to illustrate a little bit more of what that means. So again, you'll see the same slide here. You see that same trajectory going to net zero underneath in the blue wedge there. The red wedge essentially represents all the emissions that we could put into the atmosphere between now and 2050 and still technically meet our 2050 net zero target. Net zero means you add up the emissions that you put into the atmosphere, you subtract the emissions that you offset or remove from the atmosphere, and that is what you get and that is your net emission inventory. So it is entirely possible, and in fact, at this point, fairly likely, that we would overshoot our carbon budget quite significantly and still maintain and still achieve our goal of net zero by 2050. So this is something that we've been trying to do a lot of work on educating people about, because it sounds like net zero by 2050 is great, and it is, and it's a very important goal, but you got to read the fine print on it. And without a carbon budget, which is essentially a tool that would allow us to say we can emit this much by this time and this much by this time, we are in danger of overshooting 1.5 while still meeting net zero. as we all know, the consequences of exceeding that budget or of exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius are significant and pretty scary. And so what I want to talk a little bit now about is how we get to net zero by 2050 in a way that respects that climate, that carbon budget, that respects 1.5 degrees. And I think one of the key principles that we need to think about, and this picks up a little bit on what both Mark and James were talking about, is that as we rebuild from the pandemic, as we transition to a low carbon economy, we need to do it better. We need to build back better. We need to find a better way of recovering our economy in a way that's just, equitable, and inclusive, and in a way that recognizes that simply focusing on GDP is not going to get us where we need to go, that we have to have several objectives in mind as we are thinking about how we want our governments to spend money, where we want to encourage private sector investment, and how we want to be measuring all of that as not just success on GDP, but on climate, on equity, on inclusion, and all of these things, on reconciliation that we want to be advancing at the same time. And so I think I'll just highlight a couple of the areas that we've been working on that are, are going to be key areas that hold a lot of potential in terms of building back better and pairing that climate action with economic recovery. We have building retrofits. Obviously, that's it seems like a no-brainer. This one needs a lot of work, and there's a lot of potential here to help find ways to not only build new buildings, but more importantly, retrofit our existing building stock. There's a lot of job creation potential there, and we do have a GDP indicator on here because it isn't a metric that people do pay attention to, unfortunately. So, or fortunately, there's some good things about it, but just as a way of indicating that these two things are not necessarily divorced from each other. We have zero emission vehicles. We have, such an important need. That's 25% of our emissions across the country need to come from tackling transportation emissions and quite a number of jobs and of course the associated health benefits here. Another thing that, is not captured in GDP. How do we account for that when we're thinking about where to invest and what to prioritize in terms of economic recovery and development? Similarly, renewable energy, huge potential here. Price is falling dramatically, competitive with fossil-based fuels in many instances. So how do we really move in that direction? All of these things feel like kind of no-brainer things. Like, of course, we would do these things. They make sense. They're not happening at the pace and scale that we need them to. And if we're gonna stay on track to net zero by 2050. We have to step up our game on all of these, easy solutions that we have the technological know-how to do. I've talked a little bit about this, but just in general, a few of the things to sort of watch for in the next little while on this file, if you're sort of tracking it, are the announcement of a federal revised 2030 target. It is currently too high. We know that to be on track for meeting net zero by 2050, we need to have a 45% reduction in 2030, and our current target is a 30% reduction. So even this line as it stands now is too high. It needs to come down. And similarly, we are heading into the next it won't look like this, I don't think, but our next COP, which is Conference of the Parties in Glasgow this fall, which is where countries from across the world come together essentially to say, to re-articulate their commitments to how much they are going to contribute to the global effort on reducing emissions. Right now, when you add up all the contributions that are committed to from the countries across the world, we are woefully underperforming. Canada needs to step up its game and come to that table with a new commitment that reflects that 45% number that I was talking about. As I said, currently we're around 30%, and globally we need to see that kind of change as well. On the political side of things, this is something that the federal government has responsibility for, but the provincial governments, the municipal governments, as James was speaking to, this is an all hands on deck kind of situation, and we need to be pulling all the levers we can to be addressing this challenge to get us to net zero. So I will leave it at that and pass it back over.
Thank you so much, Josh. And to be able to make that connection between GDP and GHG, this is amazing. Okay, I'm feeling like people in the room are getting the fact that they've got a lot of work that they have to take on now, but it's not over yet. We do have one more presenter here. Will, if you're out there, we need you to come back into the stage. And then maybe, sorry, James, I think we have to get you to step up. Okay, it's already happening. Okay, so we're gonna now turn it over. Josha gave us this perspective on top of Mark's and James. We've got this national perspective. We understand some of the parameters that we're working with, some of the ways in which we need to think about new metrics and change. And now over to you, Will, our anchor leg, to talk about this on a planetary scale.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Can you hear me and see me as well?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I don't know how well I can kind of anchor this after all these great speakers to set this up, but I'll do my best. It's really interesting going from these questions of what is work and what is value to how should we actually be measuring and what is changing in the world of economics. And of course, GHGs and carbon is a hugely important part of that. My background's in environment and geography and environmental studies, basically. I specialized in remote sensing, and I'm passionate about the environment. It's why I do everything I do in the field I do it. And so I'm gonna turn it a little bit differently and talk a bit about technologies that help us get there. And I'm gonna frame. I think I'm going to frame this just a little bit different than talking about how we measure goods, which I think is the right kind of way to look at it from a policy standpoint. And I'll take a little bit of a different angle and say we could do a much better job measuring the cost of the goods we already produce. I think what we're coming up against a lot of the time is, are we measuring the right stuff? And I think we're all mostly convinced that, we're not measuring the right stuff. And the way I see this a lot of the time in the context of the business community is businesses are very good at externalizing costs they can get away with. And what an externality is anything from burdens on individuals to burdens on environments to burdens on society at large. And so if we can develop systems or tools that enforce the ability to basically track and watch how businesses operate, that can be on the tail end of the super important policy directions in ways that we reframe that economy. So just a little bit about what we're doing in remote sensing. This is just an example of one dam in South Africa, just showing how what we're really doing when we're talking about satellite imaging is we're monitoring the environment. The entire use case broadly around remote sensing is to understand what is happening from a distance. And at a global scale, that's monitoring the surface of the Earth from a distance, ideally at scale, so you can monitor entire regions, entire watersheds, entire eco-sensitive areas for those types of change. And in a functioning decision system, we should be able to make those measurements, understand what's happening, and make changes accordingly to try and address those types of problems. And we've been doing this in remote sensing at some way or shape or form for a long time. Landsat 1 is one of the earliest civilian satellites that went into space. 1972 is this image here on the left. And even at a basic level of just understanding things like urbanization and urban change and how the environment, or probably in this particular example, how we are impacting the environment around us, it has long been a staple of what we're trying to do in remote sensing. And there's all kinds of practical applications where this actually comes into effect. In remote sensing, we've seen this used quite a bit in the space of disasters and emergency responses. So this is a famous and one of the first early examples of radar data being used to mitigate and manage an oil spill. So this was 1996, relatively early in remote sensing age. And using remotely sensed data, specifically SAR data in this case, you're able to see where the oil spill is because it's on the surface of the water, help to contain that oil spill and mitigate that response. And this type of ability isn't just contained within our ability to respond to disasters. Our ability to measure the environment is continuous and mostly restricted by the data available. And just a last little note here, on a radar imagery, these I believe are RadarSat-1 images, which would be from a satellite produced by a Vancouver company. So Canada has a really strong heritage in the space of remote sensing as well. So here's another example of this in practice. You know, on the right, it's actually directly holding vessels accountable, using satellite data to look for vessels who are dumping oil into waters that in our case, in Canada, in the Canadian case, we can police this and actually go to court on it. And there's examples of that. Or again, on the left, in a disaster example. But emergency response is not enough. Measuring just what's happening in terms of change in a given dam region is not quite enough. We need to think about how to, in a more real-time way, hold and measure the accountability of organizations. And this has all kinds of human impacts as well. And again, we use remote sensing for these types of things to understand the scope and scale of things that happen. This is just another example of massive fires having massive impacts on individuals who are already in struggling situations. And when you can use remote sensing to quickly understand the scope and scale and of those disasters. And this is where you see the most salient examples of remote sensing. We're all familiar with this relatively recent situation that occurred, and these are a number of different remote sensing companies that were pushing their images out on Twitter, which is a common PR side of this business. When important things happen in the world, they try to take pictures and have their pictures be the ones that people see. And there's many companies playing in this space now because it really is about monitoring and watching the environment. This is another startup out of San Francisco doing SAR data, again, of the same area. And so as we take a step back to kind of ground this again, we have these goals that are slowly trickling down from, the economist standpoint of what is, why are we measuring GDP? What value does that have? All the way up to the international levels of the UN and things like sustainable development goals and how are we going to reshape our economy and build back better and all these things. And most of the sustainable development goals have a place for measuring data. And on the one hand, we have lots of data that we're swimming in that we can't make use of, but on the other hand, we can't seem to often connect all of that data to the use cases at hand. And some of this is a policy problem in terms of how we hold companies accountable. And the second is a technology problem, which is just connecting those dots on a technological level in such a way that we can actually use that data. And this starts to come directly in contact with a completely similar but different space, which is more on the investment side of things. Socially responsible investing is a thing that is growing rapidly. It's been growing as quite a bit in the past 5-10 years especially. And what it broadly kind of centers down to is this idea of holding companies accountable to both environment, social, and governance responsibilities. And the hypothesis, as I would frame it, is companies that are effective in these three domains are long-term more profitable, more effective, more inclusive, and in the end, build better companies. And so how do we play a role in holding companies to account? Things like governance is probably more of a accountability and policy way to just look at how organizations are organized. Some of social for sure fits into that, except for when we get into things like forced labor or other kind of exploitative practices around labor. And then, of course, environmental. And in the ESG space, the hardest thing to measure is environmental impact because it's really hard to know how good or bad any individual company is outside of what they claim or what an auditor may claim they're doing. And so what I think we're going to start seeing is more and more interest within this space of investment and companies and stakeholder capitalism, as recently put out, is measuring this environment side and holding it much more directly into account. And these have huge impacts when it comes to climate change moving forward. This is a slightly more kind of not quite a company example, but it gives the example and the scope of what we're talking about here. One example, I'm just going back to a dam example. There's a huge dam that is being built, and what happens when countries start building dams to capture water and thus cutting off water supply to other countries? This is the reality that we're facing moving forward. And one, just knowing that it's happening is part of that problem. Remote sensing plays a huge role in that. And then two, how do we start manifesting disputes and measuring those disputes and holding countries or companies to account in that space? This has an equivalent role in the GHG space. I'm not going to belabor too much about that aspect, but if we are going to play in reducing our carbon footprint, part of that is likely going to involve this cap and trade type model, which I'm sure Josha could speak better to it than myself, but some of that is going to be reducing emissions. Some of that is going to be having things that are net negative carbon so that you can sell those credits to those who are making those emissions. But how do you know those credits are legitimate? How do you track them back to the source? And how does that source stay valid in this context? And how long does it stay valid? What happens if those trees are burned down? What happens if your carbon credits are associated with certain farming practices that are not being held to account, for example? And so I think what we're really starting to come up against here is a lot of technology, ecology, and capital kind of coming to the same conclusions for different reasons almost. On the ecological side, which is where I've been thinking a lot of my life, problems with the environment have been bad and getting worse for most of how long I've been watching it. And we've seen technology getting better and better and more able to include more and more things. I'm thinking especially things like remote sensing or Internet of Things or blockchain. And now we're starting to see capital itself and runners of big investment firms like BlackRock talking about how climate risk is investment risk, how managing our water is part of the problem when we're issuing bonds now. We are now all coming to the same endpoint of how do we build a system that is sustainable, measurable from, I'll use a agriculture example, farm to plate, and managed for risk. And now we are starting to agree that that includes climate change, that includes societal risk, that includes stability risk, that includes all of the measures that we had already been introduced here. And so I think we do have solutions. I think the technology is getting there piece by piece, and you can look in all kinds of different places, from blockchain to IoT to remote sensing to people trying to solve these types of problems. And I'll just leave you with that to say we need to think of systems that we can measure those values, and questioning those values is important, but we need to be able to develop rules that we can also enforce. And if we have rules that we can't enforce, those rules are hard to enforce, and therefore they're toothless in many ways. And that's that.
Wow, thank you, Will. And James, if you're out there, please come on back. And what I'd love to do is just, I know that we, the sign of an amazing panel is that we do run out of time, but I'd love to do one more round for sure. And then if people have questions, you can type your questions in and post them to the stage. You can also say hi to everybody if you post it to the event, but if you want a specific question answered by a specific panelist, you can type in there. But maybe I could do one more round, just because I'm surrounded by, and I'm so lucky to work with, amazing students. And really, some of the questions that they have is, what do we do? How do we get involved? What would you recommend? I've got a project, I've got a thesis, I've got a co-op, I've got career opportunities. How do I get in the game with this? And how do I bring this to what it is that I'm doing here in my studies or in my co-op or in my career opportunities? Mark, do you mind kicking us off with advice to students, or perhaps you just want to give them more homework?
Well, I want the ideas of your students, because I've got to do the next version of this on exactly that question.
Game on.
You heard a variety of perspectives all coming at the same question. How do we make a better planet? How do we make better decisions? How do we ensure that we live in a planet that can sustain us and our lives? So the question about how you get involved, my perspective on this was very much from the economic planning on GDP. One thing I didn't raise is that there's another paper that another group at First Nations as well put out, was on ESG, about how you actually incentivize the financial markets to make good decisions around these things, around GHGs. or around everything that was touched on and remote sensing and sensing, because what you measure gets done, or what's important gets measured. And if you don't measure it, it just won't get done. So there's many avenues to go here. My advice to you on these questions is to be active. And I'm going to come at this much more from a political perspective, because politicians will respond to pressure, but the pressure has to be clear about where you think things should go. And there are millions of us in this country. 1 million points of pressure are fine, because you're starting to see a coalescing of concepts. Like it's not by accident you have a panel like this where people care. Every person here cares, and every person here is putting their talents and their efforts to the best that they can in their chosen field. And we will reach some sort of accommodation towards that, but that will only happen unless you're active, right? And that doesn't mean only protesting. It can mean your skills that I don't know exactly what each of you are going into, but is it in technology? Is it in arts? Is it in science? Just push. Get your ideas out there. Everyone has a voice. And the other thing too about how social media has changed everything in the past 25 years is that you will find like-minded people very quickly to push these things going forward. So I would suggest that your ideas are valid, and you should find a way to find others who share those ideas and just go for it.
Fantastic. Okay, over to you, James.
Great answer. Yeah, I'll tag on to that. Just get interested in whatever it is. My background was in research and big data. I fell into economic development. As I said earlier, economics put me off, and I've fallen back into economic development. And very quickly within that, I realized this thing called GDP. I had no clue what it was. And then you realize, hang on, this is like the dominant model of economic development, which has created so many of the problems that we've kind of talked about. And I realized that this is a problem I want to work on. So my big advice to all of you would be just get stuck in and just work on problems. The best career advice I ever had was don't do something you love, because you don't really know what that is. Just find problems and work on them, because there's problems in every single industry, every single business you're going to get into, and then work on the ones that you really, really care about. There will be something there that resonates, that you will have expertise on. And as Mark said there, you will find others to share that. I started off, I didn't know any economists who would challenge GDP, and I've found so many now all over the world. So find that problem. There are so many problems out there, and I guarantee if you work on something that that is a big problem, it will be something you're so passionate about, and the salaries and all the other things will just fall behind that, because you'll be working on something that is right. So that would be my advice.
Beautiful. Thank you, James. Over to you, Josha.
I mean, I just echo everything that Mark and James have said. Like, I think it really is about thinking about how you think change happens. If you're excited about technology and that's where you want to put your time and energy, awesome. Like, that's great. We totally need technology. If you're excited about policy change and law and that aspect of things, awesome. Like, do that, put your energy there. If you're excited about behavior change, like what is it that how do you think change happens in the world? What excites you about change? And direct your energy in that way. I think that's the advice I would give, because as Mark pointed out so eloquently, like, there is no one solution to this problem. It is going to be solved by a collection of like individual organic things that are happening and are all kind of pushing in the same direction. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. I would say, don't let whatever education you have be a barrier to you. Don't think, oh, I don't have this education, or I don't have this background or this training. Like, my bachelor's degree is in history and film. So, and I went on to do some other grad work after that, but like, I'm by all rights not, that would not qualify me to do what I do right now in some sort of traditional sense. So just, experience and doing things is key. And I would say that one of the threads for me that runs through that I see a lot of need for is the idea of, and Mark touched on this, like, what we don't measure, we don't act on. And when we're sort of pressed with, and from my perspective, policymakers who are reluctant and risk averse and don't necessarily want to do things too differently, the more data we can provide them about the outcome of the choices that we are presenting to them and the solutions we're presenting to them, the more comfortable they are. And the more that we can tailor that data to the kinds of things we want to be measuring, and say, if you implement this policy, this is the impact on water, this is the impact on climate, this is the impact on equity, and find ways that are like the become more mainstream, so that those indicators become the things that our policymakers are paying attention to. And I think that's a really important part of this equation is, we need to make sure that our policymakers shift in the way that they are thinking about the decisions that they are making.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Josha. And one more here, over to you, Will.
Oh man, being at the tail end of these recommendations is tough. I don't have too much of great value to add past all of these great recommendations. What I'd add simply is to say, I think one thing that is very, very helpful in this type of space is to have more and more generalists. And I think many of you fall into this category of having very different academic backgrounds. I think we see an education system and a discourse that is strongly around getting the right type of STEM jobs to get the right type of STEM work. And so much of what I'm seeing in many businesses right now is the hard to find skills are the generalists, are the interdisciplinaries, those that have done more than one thing. So if you have something that is not your core skill set that you are passionate about, I would highly recommend playing in that area, because it will bring you value. And better yet, if you start applying some of your existing skills to a new passion, you start to do really interesting stuff that often people haven't thought of.
Oh, what a team. Thank you so much, our fantastic panel. Talk about people who are passionate about something and sharing with everybody. That's all of you. We really are so grateful. We do have, I knew that we would run out of time, but we will have a networking session. And the way that it works in Hopin, if you haven't worked in Hopin before, is that it's pretty interesting. like it wasn't interesting enough to try to share your slides, Mark. So over on the left-hand side, there should be something that says networking. And when you click on that, these will be smaller groups. I think, you'll be paired up and you'll be able to find people if you'd like to ask a question. And again, I want to really respect your time if people can't hang out. But if you can, it would be great. We could give it a go and see if we like this. So if you are game, please click your networking button. And again, I really want to thank everyone. The team at Northeastern, both Vancouver, Seattle. I think we had people from San Francisco on the line, over in Victoria, at University of Victoria, the digital supercluster. And last but not least, again, one more time, Olivia, you're wonderful. Thank you for getting this all organized too. So let's get into networking. If people can hang out, that would be great. And thank you all again.